Hi, everybody. It's Peter Schiff. It's Thursday, June 18th, 2009. Basically, what I want to talk about today is what is happening with Barack Obama's new comprehensive scheme to re-regulate and over-regulate the financial services industry. I work in that industry. Euro Pacific Capital, my brokerage firm, is regulated by FINRA, which used to be called the NASD, and by the SEC. And my business is extremely regulated. I employ 4 or 5 people, and their sole jobs are to keep me compliant with government regulations. And it's a very difficult thing to do, and oftentimes we inadvertently don't necessarily comply with them all because there's so many, and there's so many new ones, and there's different agencies, and they're constantly changing the rules. Meanwhile, I don't believe that the regulations are doing a good job. I don't think they're serving the investors well. I think that the brokerage industry and the financial service industry is worse off, is less efficient, and I think individuals get worse advice and lower quality service as a result of these regulations. Meanwhile, none of the regulations prevented the NASDAQ bubble or the lousy advice that was dispensed by brokerage firms. None of these regulations that were put in effect after the bursting of the NASDAQ bubble. We got Sarbanes-Oxley and a lot of bad regulation as a result of that. And then after September 11th, we got the Patriot Act and a lot of regulations on my industry from the Patriot Act and Anti-Money Laundering Act. I mean, there's so much more regulation today than when I first got into the business. It's almost amazing that firms can stay in business. I mean, the largest brokerage firms, the ones that are getting bailed out by the government, they have the economies of scale to withstand all this regulation. Smaller firms like mine, it's much more difficult. And of course, small firms even smaller than mine, it's very difficult for people to start their own firms now because the regulation is just a killer. Meanwhile, now the government thinks we need even more regulation. The fact that all of this bad stuff happened to Wall Street firms that were already highly regulated. Bernie Madoff, his whole scam took place right under the nose of the SEC. And the only reason they caught him was because investors wanted their money back and the scheme fell apart of its own. If that hadn't happened, he would still be running his Ponzi scheme right under the nose of the SEC. Meanwhile, the government is blaming this crisis on a lack of regulation, when nothing could be further from the truth. We suffered from an excess of regulation. We suffered from government interference that interrupted market regulation, that would have done a good job of reining in all the excesses from which we're now suffering. If market forces had been allowed to operate in a financial system, we never would have had all this risk-taking. Firms would not have been levered up to the extent that they were. Government intervention is what created that. First, you had the Federal Reserve, which kept interest rates artificially low, which made it possible and profitable for everybody on Wall Street and Main Street to speculate and to borrow a lot of money. And you had the moral hazards imposed by government-sponsored enterprises like Freddie and Fannie that were guaranteeing mortgages that otherwise never would have been originated without that guarantee, or there certainly would have been much tougher lending standards, higher down payments, there would have been more scrutiny. Of course, Freddie and Fannie are not even mentioned in this new massive government re-regulation and over-regulation of the financial industry. And of course, they were at the epicenter of the problem because they were working with government guarantees. And so what the government is doing now is just imposing more burdensome regulation that's simply going to reduce the competitiveness of the financial service industry. It's going to reduce the quality of the industry, both the investment advice that individuals get, and it's going to increase the costs, which of course are going to be passed on. And one of the biggest ironies here is that the Federal Reserve is being asked to be a systemic risk regulator. Well, the Federal Reserve is the biggest systemic risk creator. They're not going to regulate the risk that they create. Also, we're trying to come up with a way to regulate, and the Fed is going to regulate the entities that are too big to fail. Well, why are we making entities too big to fail in the first place? What we should be doing is sending a clear message that no entity is too big to fail. Then market forces will come into play. Companies won't get too big. There won't be excessive risk-taking. Creditors will be on their guard. But when we disarm creditors, when we tell creditors, don't worry, these entities are too big to fail, well, then they're going to borrow a lot of money because the lenders don't care because they know their investment is protected by the government. Now the government creates a situation where regulation is required, where if they simply would have minded their own business, we would need no regulation because we would have market forces regulating the financial services industry. So instead of the government learning from their mistakes, from understanding that it was excessive regulation and government interference in the market that created the problem, what the government is going to do is get even bigger. We're going to make the entities that created the problems, we're going to give them even more power, and we've learned nothing. And all we're doing is sowing the seeds of a much greater disaster down the line. What we really should be doing is examining the way government regulation and government moral hazards led to this problem. And instead of looking for new regulations and empowering government, we should look at removing those regulations that disarm the market. We want to re-embrace free market capitalism. We want to re-embrace market principles. And we want to move away from the government interference and the government meddling in the system that created all the problems, that led to all the excessive risk-taking, that allowed all these imbalances to develop, that blew up all the bubbles. You know, the fact that they burst, all of this never would have happened had the government not inflated them in the first place. But just like we learned nothing from the experience with the NASDAQ bubble, we've learned nothing from this bubble, and all of this regulation is going to accomplish nothing but making government even bigger and making the distortions on the free market even more dramatic. The result is going to be even bigger problems, and we are sweeping this under the rug. If the politicians think they're running to the rescue and solving these problems because we have more bureaucracy, and we're going to create more agencies. This new bill creates new regulatory agencies, more bureaucrats, more big government that the rest of us have to pay for, more inefficient use of our scarce resources, of our people. And instead of putting people to work productively, we're now going to put more people to work unproductively. And who knows how many more people I might have to hire at Euro Pacific Capital so that I can comply with more needless and unnecessary regulations that will do nothing to improve the quality of the services that I provide to my clients. It will simply run up the costs, and ultimately I might have to pass on those costs to my clients in higher fees or higher commissions. This is a disgrace. We've learned absolutely nothing. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks everybody for listening. So long.